what are numbers at the end of the day? Numbers are just symbols. They're just symbols. Like A, B, and C are symbols. We just use them to communicate. But what do those symbols actually do? They tell a story. They tell the story of the organization. You can tell the story of the organization in words, and you can tell it in numbers.
Do you wonder how trailblazing leaders sense at scale, evolve to innovate, and align the actions in this increasingly digital world? Welcome to the Exploring Leaders podcast. The experienced team at Degosian interviews leaders from around the world for insights and inspiration on how to lead in the digital age. In this episode, Degosian founder Lizelette Engstem, who is also an independent board chair and director, researcher, author, and advisor, asks the questions.
Our guest today is Helen Wiseman. Helen is an independent board chair and director, as well as leadership coach. She works on boards in UK, Australia, and South Africa, as well as with leaders and board members all over the world. Helen is guiding her companies from both board member and chair position, and she's helping leaders and board members to become more effective in their roles, including using more coaching techniques to achieve it. This episode focuses on her journey and approaches she finds effective as coach and board member. Warm welcome, Helen Wiseman. I'm delighted to have you here, and I'll ask you a couple of questions. So you are a board chair. You're a non-executive director, but you're also a coach and mentor, and work on a number of committees. Warm welcome, Helen.
Thank you very much indeed. It's nice to be here.
I wanted first to start with our listeners to get a bit more to, how did you get away? What's your background? What took you there?
I think there's a great Steve Jobs quote, which I realised was actually great life advice, which is, you can't join the dots looking forward. You can only sort of join the dots looking backwards. So, way led on to way. So I left my corporate role back in 2009 with an ambition to sit on boards, as well as build up get my coaching qualifications and build up a coaching practice. And then I got a whole round of feedback that basically was a far more polite version of, Helen, you're kidding yourself. You're too young to kind of sit on board. And at that stage, I was already sitting on, a couple of not-for-profit boards. And in fact, my very first board that I ever served on, and the very first meeting, so this is my very first board meeting, I was actually made the chair. Before this call, we were talking about this sort of accidental chair appointment. And I mean, I hadn't actually fully, because I kind of thought in my mind, I can chair a meeting, I can facilitate a meeting, I'm good at that. And then I had to get taken aside after about 6 months and kind of have the role sort of explained. I mean, I was doing okay. I had to have the role explained to me as to what the chair role really kind of was. But either which way, I was told I needed to go and get some broader experience. So I ended up, co-founding a startup business in the insurance and financial services space, and just collected a whole sort of variety of different experiences. I served on more what I'd say not-for-profit boards, but I chose boards that, obviously were very motivating, but actually had sort of some commercial element to them, and sort of built up my experience that way. And then, I get a phone call one day to chair an audit committee. It was a paid kind of role. It wasn't actually a board role. It was a bit unusual. And that was the thing that I suppose really started the board career side of things off. And again, one opportunity then led on to another opportunity, then led up to another opportunity, obviously by doing good work. And then the coaching side of it, I got my coaching qualification, and again, that built over time. I worked with a couple of leadership firms. I think I learned more about leadership and my style than perhaps I may have even taught my clients. But I sort of managed to sort of build that into, I guess, my whole repertoire.
I think it's fantastic, and it's for sure bring value to each other. If you were to look at your kind of two broad roles, what are some common myths, do you think, about your roles that isn't true, that people think about these roles?
Oh, that's some good ones. So I mean, one area that I specialize in is that, I chair audit committees. I'm an accountant. And it's very easy to, I suppose, pigeonhole that role. It's very easy to anything to do with kind of, numbers, bang, it just goes straight across to the audit committee. And I think people don't necessarily realise, unless of course you sit on the audit committee, like what a privileged position you're in terms of your ability to engage with the organisation, the level of deeper knowledge that you get of the organisation appropriately, what is it, nose in, hands out. And, I would strongly encourage people to look and take on that role. Often risk is associated with it as well. And, it's more about the quality of the questions that you ask. So in a way, if you don't understand the numbers, as long as somebody on the committee does, well, that's brilliant, because you're going to go, well, what's, if you got the courage, well, what's that? And it's amazing how often those questions hit the target. And the other thing that I would say, which I think people often miss, is, what are numbers at the end of the day? And I'm putting this in financial terms. Numbers are just symbols. They're just symbols. Like A, B, and C are symbols. We just use them to communicate. But what do those symbols actually do? They tell a story. They tell the story of the organisation. You can tell the story of the organisation in words, and you can tell it in numbers. They're just symbols at the end of the day. And I find that when you reframe it that way, it suddenly kind of opens it right up. And I've used that as an opportunity to engage others in the audit committee process by actually, telling the story, plus at the same time, making sure the accounting standards are being followed and engaging with the auditors and all the rest of it. So I think there's a great myth there. And the other sort of part of the audit committee work is somehow, well, that's not strategy, or that's kind of not commercial. But of course, again, numbers tell a very kind of powerful story. We talk about sustainability, ESG, well, C, cash.
Absolutely.
So that would be a myth. And then the other sort of myth is, if you, in a way, if you kind of look at my sort of, LinkedIn profile, I encourage you to do so. Please send me your invites. It kind of looks like, I do sort of board work over here. I now have to sort of chair boards as well. And then I do coaching over here. Wrong. It's actually very similar underlying processes. The quality of the questions that you ask, the way in which you ask them, the way in which you facilitate getting the best out of people, and the types of responses, which is even more sort of critical at the chair level. So those skills are absolutely sort of intrinsic, to my mind, to being a really good, effective board member, on top of, your traditional kind of skills. Strategy. How do you kind of think about and challenge strategy? Sure, you can, bring out your Porter's 5 forces and your SWOT analysis. But, the power of a really good, broad coaching question, if we say yes to this, then what is it that we're kind of saying no to? Tell me more about that. And the best question of all, anything else? And ask it 2 or 3 times, and then, pause. So, there's some examples of the way that I kind of think about those roles that I have.
I think it's lovely, and I surely love the question, anything else.
Yes.
It brings out also what's top of mind from others, which is fantastic.
Simple, 2 words.
Simple.
You think as a board director, you have to, and of course you do, obviously your experience, your insights, etc. And you can show up as being kind of really clever. I can be really clever when it comes to how I talk about the annual report. But geez, the power of just a really simple 2-word question. And the impact.
So I wanted to start first by asking a couple of questions around coaching, and then come back to board work. So if you just help us a bit, how do you see that the field of coaching and psychology, which is this, has kind of changed over the recent years?
Good question. I think there's a lot more research that's being done in this space. Coaching was initially sort of seen as being a bit of an airy-fairy profession, and also, in the early days was often associated with remedial coaching, like if somebody suggested a coach. I think that has completely sort of turned on its head as people have realised, and through the research that's been done, is the power of of those skills, such that now, the conversation has completely changed to how do we create a coaching culture? People might use slightly different language. How do we create a coaching culture in this organization? And in fact, the Center for Creative Leadership has come up with, and it's purely around culture, but they've come up with this amazing model called Better Conversations. Really strongly encourage people to have a look at it. And what they're doing is through the art of better conversations, asking questions, listening, etc. They've got a nice little model, really simple model. What they're really talking about is creating a coaching culture, but they're using kind of very human terms around it. There's a huge realization around organizational culture, and obviously the board has a very critical role to play in that. And coaching is now very much center stage, to the point that I think on LinkedIn, it was a TED talk actually, everybody needs a coach. Like, provocative.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's actually very right, and we probably needed it yesterday, most of us.
I walked my talk. I've got one.
Yeah.
You can check out more hints and tips in the blog post covering this podcast episode of Exploring Leaders at the Degoshen blog, which you can find at degoshen.com.
So, going further in that, how do you think that leaders, and not the least board members, can explore coaching in a better way than what they do today?
Again, I think there's two parts to that. So one is, me as an individual board member and the contribution that I make. Am I doing that as effectively as I could? Am I using the right kind of thinking skills, decision-making skills? Communication and influencing style is huge around the boardroom table. So having an individual coach to help and support you in that, and even just to be a sounding board, because there's plenty of dilemmas that kind of operate at the boardroom table. And you can be sat, especially if you're like a new director, but even if you're an old established one, you sat there going, oh geez, what do I do with this? Sometimes just having the sounding board, great coach only asks us 2 or 3 questions, and then you start talking and you actually resolve it for yourself. So I think that's one area. But I think the other emerging areas, they talk, boardroom dynamics, I suppose, culture at the boardroom table. It's very new, but thinking about how a coach or a facilitator can work with the board as a whole, to observe those dynamics, to help kind of navigate, if you like, what might be some of those roadblocks, or to kind of enable a better understanding of different people's viewpoints and where they're coming from. Very new area.
And still very unusual, probably, but it's an opportunity to make sure that in those few meetings that you actually have, you be super effective.
It's having a growth, because you think having a growth mindset as a board. And also, I think it was about 2 to 3 years ago now, but the Australian corporate regulator actually did some research where they put, in this case, a psychologist in the boardroom to actually watch boardroom dynamics. And the research was around, I suppose, the linkage between board culture and outcomes for that organization. And that got a lot of media attention to put a psychologist in the boardroom, but even the regulators now focusing on the boardroom culture as being either an enabler of, or as a key kind of governance facet, in addition to audit committee nominations, committee risk management, etc.
So, super interesting. You just mentioned something I wanted to ask you about, and that was the growth mindset. So can you tell us a bit what you mean with that, and what does it mean in the context of a board?
So Carol Dweck is often cited as being the thought leader around growth mindset, and there's a little bit of debate about has that been taken out of context in terms of her original research, but never mind that. One board I sat on was doing a culture piece with the leadership and then cascading that down into management, which was around growth mindset. So they were taking the growth mindset model, and then so we decided that, we should also do it as a board. And so she took us through the same sort of presentation. It was the most powerful discussion. I mean, talk about, really different topic from the typical stuff that sits on the agenda. And of course, one of the powerful things about what I find about the growth mindset, model, whether it's steeped strictly in the research or not, it's not so much the growth mindset, it's the fixed mindset. And we can all suddenly kind of flip into the fixed mindset. It's a very human thing to do. But having that awareness as individuals, when we flip, what are those triggers when we flip into the fixed mindset? I mean, that generated a lot of discussion. And then it meant that in subsequent board meetings, we'd bring it kind of back up when we review the board meeting at the end. Really well-governed organisation. Oh, like so was the chair, but it wasn't. But, we sort of, we challenge each other. It's like, oh, hang on a minute, in terms of what you've just said there, how do you think, might you be approaching that with a fixed mindset? And it gave us all permission to have, if you like, this particular terminology, but that little bit more kind of courage in the boardroom to challenge each other. But what it did for trust building as well was fabulous.
Very interesting. And in that sense, the growth mindset is also a bit about being open to future thoughts in a way.
It allows the board members to be vulnerable, because that's the thing. I mean, I think many board members actually quietly, it's a bit like the silent scream, can feel a bit vulnerable in the boardroom because it's complex. I mean, we're dealing with some of the challenges that we're dealing with today. I mean, it is just complex, but that's kind of that sense that maybe I'm the only one who's feeling this way, or it just opened that up right up, and made us realize that in fact we're all in this together.
So I'll give you a question which can be 3 different answers or one answer depending on how you look at it. But my question is really, what makes you thrive as a coach? What makes you thrive as a board member? And what makes you thrive as a coaching board member?
Oh, I think it's one answer. So, I've defined for myself, my life's purpose. And that is to be a catalyst that unlocks the potential of people and organisations in unexpected ways, in order to have, a positive impact on the people and stakeholders around them. So, the coaching work that I do is very much with that objective in mind, and the board work that I do is very much with that objective in mind. So I guess, even how I approach the audit committee work, obviously strong role on the board is still informed by that purpose. I'm here to unlock the potential of this organisation. Right. And the tool that I'm using, the spanner that I'm using, is the way that we sort of financially report. Numbers tell a story. They tell a story to our people. I mean, and on it goes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and also that you pull it together is actually what you're saying. For you, it's kind of the same. You're board is a collective pursuit, but how do I take responsibility for getting the best out of every individual board member? Now, as the chair, that sounds a bit kind of leadership-y, but even as an individual sort of director, you can give positive energy or you can take energy away. You can ask a question in a way that really sort of taps into that individual director's knowledge. How do I kind of look out for where somebody might be feeling a little bit sort of uncertain, and how can I make sure that I don't cause loss of face even amongst the executive teams and the finance teams that I deal with, because we do operate in a really complex world. So again, there's a very coming at it with positive intent. It's a very clever way of being able to surface the issues without being afraid to constructively challenge. But there's a very artful way of being able to get the best out of people.
To get even more value out of the podcast series Exploring Leaders, you can find everything from research reports to advice and courses at the Degoshen website, which you can find at degoshen.com.
So we've been through 3 quite unusual years, looking backward. What are your most important lessons that you learned during the last 3 years?
Oh, never take the good times for granted. Never take your people for granted. I mean, just the extraordinary pressures on everyone, on the executives trying to kind of run the organizations in these conditions, I guess on the board, on the oversight, but everyone's got personal family and personal things. You never know what's going on in someone's life. So that's kind of real key learning. I think, resiliency, a lot of people are talking about resiliency and sustainability. I mentioned the 4-letter word, cash.
Yeah.
Just one of the debates that we had on one of my boards over a few years was the so-called lazy balance sheet, because there was, quite a lot of cash in the business. And of course, that lazy balance sheet, turned out to be an absolute sort of lifesaver. It's completely sort of reframed the way that I sort of look at and think about a balance sheet. And it's also made me look at and think about the type of assets that we own or should be owning and how we create value sort of out of those. And because it is such a complex world and so changing, it comes back to strategy. And one of the things I love about strategy is a great book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, is what you say no to. And in a world that's kind of highly sort of distracted and a lot of, doomsayers and commentators, and then the whole kind of ESG avalanche, I think you need to be crystal clear on your strategy and what you're saying no to.
Yeah. And
just reinforced all that for me.
Yeah, and have the really good debates around that. So I wanted to move on to, who do you look to for insight and inspiration? Is there a company you think we should keep our eyes on, or is there a leader you think we should keep our eyes on?
Well, I'll plug one company. Say self-interest, it's not that. It's just I used to sit on their board, and I stepped down about 2 years ago. But one of the best examples of governance I've ever kind of come across, and it's an organisation called Choice, otherwise known as the Australian Consumer Association. And they had to do an entire sort of digital transformation. No one was sure kind of, what the pandemic was going to bring, but seeing how they've grown as an organisation, how they practice governance, and it's a member-based association. It's got something like, I'm not sure what today's membership is, but around about 200,000 members. Now, how they engage with their members. And even, the chair actually sends a communique after every board meeting. I say the chair, in fact, they've got they had a joint chair model. They send a communicator to the members after every board meeting. So I think that's one of the best examples of governance that I've seen to watch. In terms of, people that I admire, I admire, many. I really admire the chair of, the big corporation board who I sit on, who's, just brings so much wisdom, so much experience, and really engages with every individual board member. So I think it's more the characteristics. It's hard to kind of point to this person, this person, this person.
Right.
So look for good examples. And in fact, Lisa, I'm going to have to say, this is not where you were coming from at all, but you're very much an inspiration for me. Just how you crafted your own sort of role, the energy and passion that you bring to it. You're such a champion and such an advocate for the director community, in such a giver. And yet at the same time, you don't suffer fools gladly. I'm sure you run a tight ship on your boards, and so it's that sort of that generosity with very clear sort of strategic mindset. So there you go.
Thank you so much. I'm super humble. I think one of the things that I have put out that I also need to work on is actually to create hope. I think we're absolutely right now, you said it before, all of these doomsayers, yes, and I do agree, we have a lot of crises, but we need to show there are actually not even one, there's many ways forward, and we need to be finding those ways and exposing those ways and being champions of those ways. And you are actually doing that also, both with the specific board engagements you're doing, but also bringing the entire coaching and mentoring. And we haven't mentioned that you actually lead the entire mentor program for the board directors, and you've done it for several years. So if I take that as an example, what are your key learnings from that?
From the director mentoring program, that just how much that sounding board is needed. There are some very sort of common challenges, especially for sort of newer directors. How do I translate my executive experience, and how do I be kind of more effective at the board when I'm used to kind of being the front charging CEO is quite a common one. Just the amount of wisdom that resides within both the mentor community, but interestingly in the mentee community. So we actually bring the mentees together in a monthly. We're just about to start it up with this year's cohort. We actually bring the mentees together as a peer group. But even there, the level of wisdom and experience that comes forward, and the generosity of spirit in wanting to genuinely help has really kind of reinforced for me that not only do we need the one-on-one conversations, but actually we need confidential, safe space for Chatham House rules, for peer conversations too, because it is a really interesting world at the moment, and nobody, all of these challenges are once in a generation challenges that few of us have ever had to navigate. And while some can point to the last round of inflation, the reality is most directors haven't really experienced that. So those are the two things that I see as being very, very powerful. And just on about the optimism, I think it's difficult, but I think there's cause, well, not in every case. I mean, behind every challenge is opportunity. But I think, if you think about getting the best out of people and the amount of talent that resides in any one kind of organization, how can we harness that collective knowledge so much more? When I see brilliance in people, and I see it everywhere, even when they make mistakes, I can put that well and truly in context because I see their magnificence. Wow, there's huge cause for optimism.
And it's wonderful. So I also wanted to give people a chance to connect with you, if it's okay. So how would they follow you? Where do they find you?
The best way to find me is on LinkedIn. Helen Wiseman, Global Citizen. Very flattering photo, although Zoom's not doing too bad a job today. So hopefully you can easily find me as a non-executive director. Yeah. Otherwise, actually, I'm more than happy to share my email address. It's helen@helenwiseman.com.au. You can reach me that way too.
Very kind. And I always end with a bit of a more strange question, but I think it's fun. And that is, if you were a furniture, what would you be?
Oh my goodness me. If I were a furniture, what would I be? I don't know. I mean, I guess, go with your gut instinct as to what springs to mind is a table.
Okay, and tell me why a table?
Well, table have obviously multiple uses. So, it's a place where, a table, I'm looking at my table, which is my desk. People do their work. They've got their computers, they've got their laptops. So, you need a table in order to be able to bring forth that brilliance. But, tables also social. I mean, I'm looking, one sort of behind you in that nice kind of living room environment. Tables are also social. It's where people break bread. It's where people drink, soft drinks or wine in my case. It's that kind of social environment. You can't live without a table. You could, but, it wouldn't be the same.
That's wonderful. You can't.
And a boardroom table. Yeah.
No, you can't live without a table. You can't live without a Helen Wiseman to be inspired by. Thank you so much, Helen. It's been a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thanks for listening to Exploring Leaders, a podcast produced by Degotion with the ambition to inspire insightful leadership in the digital age. If you found this episode interesting, join the momentum to amplify the voices of trailblazing leaders by sharing it with others for inspiration. For any questions or recommendations on other inspiring leaders you like to listen to, contact us via our website, degotion.com, or via social media as LinkedIn or Twitter.